The crash. The sky was on fire. Flames tore through the clouds as the UNSC Venture Dawn broke apart in the upper atmosphere of Aurelius IV. Metal screamed. Alarms blared. Red lights flashed through the smoke-filled halls of the crashing ship. Inside, chaos ruled. Soldiers ran. Systems failed. Everyone knew it was going down, and fast. Lieutenant Marcus Hale was strapped into his seat, his knuckles white as he gripped the armrests. The deck shook under him like a wild animal. Sparks shot from the console in front of him. The voice of the ship's AI tried to stay calm, but even the machine couldn't hide the fear in its tone. Warning. Hull integrity failure. Impact in 35 seconds. 35 seconds. That was all the time he had to live or die. The ship hit the planet like a meteor. Trees shattered. Rocks split. The ground exploded as the massive craft skidded across the surface, tearing a deep scar into the alien soil. Metal twisted. Fires bloomed. Then silence. Marcus came to in darkness. His ears rang. His face was cut. Blood ran into his eyes. He unbuckled his harness and fell forward, coughing from the thick black smoke around him. The ship's interior was a mess. Broken lights, torn wires, bodies on the floor. He checked pulses. No one else moved. He was alone. Staggering through the wreckage, Marcus pulled an emergency mask over his face and grabbed a flashlight. The beam cut through the smoke and dust. He had to get out. The core was damaged, and if it overloaded, the whole place would go up in a fireball. But then, he heard something. A sound. Faint. Strangled. Not the groan of metal or the crackle of fire. It was a voice. A small voice. He froze. Turned. Listened. It came again. Weak, almost like a whimper. Not a shout for help. More like someone trying to cry, but barely able to. He followed the sound. Through the broken hall. Past the collapsed support beams. There, in the middle of the ruined cargo bay, he saw her. A figure. Small. Half buried under a fallen piece of steel. Not human. Her skin shimmered faintly, silver blue in color. Her face was soft, almost childlike, with large glowing eyes that blinked slowly as she looked up at him. Blood ran from her forehead. Her arm was crushed beneath the debris. Marcus stared, confused. This wasn't possible. No alien prisoners were aboard the Venture Dawn. She shouldn't be here. Then he saw something around her neck. A tag. A metal chain. He stepped closer, brushing off the dust. A military dog tag. It read, Mira Hale. His name. His last name. He stumbled back, shocked. Who was this girl? How did she get on the ship? Why was she wearing his name? Another explosion rocked the wreck. The lights flickered again. The AI's broken voice returned, faint and crackling. Core breach imminent. Evacuate immediately. Marcus looked down at the girl. She was staring at him. Not speaking. Just watching. He could leave. There was no time. The place would blow in less than a minute. Every second he waited, he risked death. But something in her eyes stopped him. They were scared, but not begging. It was like she already knew what he would do. With a yell, Marcus grabbed the metal beam and pulled. Pain shot through his arms. The weight was crushing. It wouldn't budge. The girl winced, clearly in pain. He tried again. This time, he used a broken pipe as a lever. He braced his foot, pushed with all his strength, and the beam shifted, just enough. She slid free with a soft cry. Marcus lifted her into his arms. She was light, weak, barely conscious. He turned and ran, past the fire, past the bodies, toward the cracked exit hatch where wind screamed through the breach. Behind him, the ship groaned. The reactor was seconds away from detonating. He jumped out into the jungle just as the ship exploded behind him. The blast knocked him off his feet. Trees bent, the air went white. But he was alive. And so was she. Lying in the soft dirt, breathing hard, Marcus looked at the alien girl in his arms. She looked back at him. And for a moment, everything went still. The sky above them was no longer burning. But Marcus knew, whatever had just happened, it was only the beginning. The rescue. Smoke curled through the air like ghostly fingers. The jungle beyond the wreckage was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no wind, just the low, eerie crackle of flames behind them and the sharp scent of burning metal and fuel. Marcus Hale didn't speak. He couldn't. His throat was dry, his lungs burning. Every part of his body ached. But still, he moved. The girl, no, the being, in his arms weighed almost nothing. Her skin was cooler than human skin, soft like silk, but there was blood on her forehead, and she was struggling to stay awake. Her silver-blue eyelids fluttered. Her breathing was shallow. Marcus tightened his grip and pushed forward. Behind them, the remains of the Venture Dawn were still burning. What was left of the ship's hull had collapsed after the blast. If he had waited another 10 seconds, they'd both be ash now. He had no idea where he was going. Aurelius 4 wasn't even supposed to be a live mission zone. It was just a recon waypoint. No real scans, no known settlements, no official maps. Just thick jungle, strange terrain, and an alien sky with 3 moons hanging low in the clouds. But Marcus was a soldier, and soldiers kept moving. He spotted a rise in the ground up ahead. Rocks, maybe a cave, some kind of shelter. He pushed through the dense plants, leaves the size of doors, vines like cables, and reached the rocky hill just as the wind picked up. Ash and dust blew past him in swirling gusts. There, an opening. A natural cave, half covered in moss and roots, big enough to crawl into. He ducked inside and laid the girl gently on the stone floor. The walls were damp. Water dripped somewhere deeper in. It wasn't much, but it was safe. For now. Marcus sat back, chest heaving. And finally, he spoke. "What the hell are you?" She didn't answer. Of course she didn't. She was unconscious again. Pale. Bruised. The strange blood on her temple was dark purple, thick like oil. It clung to her skin, but didn't flow fast. Maybe she wasn't hurt too badly. Maybe she was just in shock. He stared at her face. So human, yet not. Her ears were smaller. Her eyes larger, more reflective. Her hair was almost metallic in color, like strands of liquid silver. But there was something familiar in her expression. Something painfully familiar. He reached down and lifted the dog tag again. Mira Hale. His name. And not just a name. It was etched in human military format. Serial number. Blood type. Earth date of birth. 2193. She looked no older than 17. Marcus was 32. There was no way she was his sister. No chance she was a cousin or clone. Genetic experiments were banned, and even if they weren't, how would an alien girl have this? A cold thought crept into his mind. Was she from the future? No, that made no sense. Time travel was science fiction. This wasn't some holovid. This was real. Too real. But then, why did she look at him like that? Back on the ship. As if she knew him. As if she trusted him. Marcus shook his head and pulled out his survival kit. He had to stay focused. He found a heat blanket, wrapped it around her. He crushed a water tablet into a bottle and left it beside her lips. Then he sat back and checked the beacon on his wrist. Broken. Of course it was. No signal. No rescue. No way to call for backup. Command probably thought he was dead. Hell, maybe he was supposed to be. He leaned his head back against the stone wall and closed his eyes. That's when she spoke. A whisper. Marcus. His eyes snapped open. She hadn't moved. Her eyes were still shut. But her lips were moving. Marcus Hale. He stared at her. Can you hear me? he asked. Her eyes opened slowly. Those glowing silver-blue irises locked onto his face. For a long moment, she just looked at him. Then she whispered one more word. Father. Marcus felt the breath leave his chest, like he'd been punched. What did you say? But she was already unconscious again, her head lolling to the side. Breath shallow and slow. He stood up fast. He paced. He looked at her, then the tag, then back at her. It didn't make sense. None of it did. But he knew one thing for sure. If she could speak his name, if she had his name, then something far bigger than a crash had just happened. And someone, somewhere, was going to come looking for her. He wasn't sure if they'd be friendly. So Marcus did what any soldier would do. He started preparing for war. The awakening. Night fell like a curtain of ink across Aurelius IV. 3 pale moons rose one by one, casting strange silver light over the jungle. Wind rustled the leaves outside the cave, carrying unfamiliar sounds. Clicks, hums, distant howls. But inside, it was quiet. Still, almost peaceful. Marcus Hale didn't sleep. He sat near the cave wall, his back straight, rifle resting across his knees, one eye on the entrance, the other on the girl, Mira, lying motionless under the thermal blanket. He cleaned the blood from her face. Her skin was smoother than anything he'd ever seen. Not a mark left behind. No scars. Not even pores. She didn't look like a threat. But that didn't mean she wasn't one. She had whispered his name. She had called him father. And she wore a military tag that bore his last name. That wasn't random. That wasn't luck. It was personal. The cave flickered with the soft orange glow of a heat pack he'd cracked open. A single bead of sweat rolled down Marcus's temple. He stared at her and wondered what kind of storm was coming next. Then, without warning, her eyes snapped open. She bolted upright, gasping for breath. Marcus raised his rifle in a heartbeat. "Stay down," he said. "You're safe, but don't move too fast." She looked around in panic, her chest rising and falling quickly. Her silver-blue eyes darted over the cave, the jungle outside, then landed on him, and she froze. For a long moment, neither of them moved, just silence and the sound of her breathing. Then she whispered, "You're real." Marcus frowned. "What?" "You weren't supposed to survive the crash," she said softly, her voice full of wonder and something close to sadness. "The records, they said you died here. That you never made it off the ship." Marcus lowered the rifle slightly. "What records?" Mira didn't answer. Instead, she slowly reached up and touched the dog tag hanging from her neck. She seemed to be checking that it was still there. "You saved me," she said. "Yeah," Marcus said. "You were pinned. Would have died in the fire. Mind telling me how the hell you got on a UNSC vessel? You're not on the crew manifest." "I wasn't supposed to be," she said. "I boarded it by force. I needed to find you before the jump point." "Jump point?" Marcus asked. "You mean Earth orbit?" "No," she said slowly. "Before the time breach. Before it locked down." He blinked. "Time breach." She nodded. "I came from a parallel thread. A different version of this timeline. I crossed over using an unstable corridor. It won't open again. Not for me." Marcus stared at her, not sure if she was lying or insane. "You're telling me you're from another universe?" "Yes," she said, without hesitation. He exhaled hard, stood, and ran a hand down his face. "That's impossible." "No," she said, "it's just classified. In your world, they're still pretending it can't be done." Marcus turned sharply. "Why? Why are you here?" Mira hesitated, then said, "To stop the war." That stopped him cold. "What war?" he asked, voice low. "The one you start," she said quietly. A chill passed through the cave like a sudden draft of cold air. Marcus looked at her, heart pounding now. "I've never started a war in my life." You haven't yet, she said. But you will. In my world, the human race pushed too far, too fast. There was a preemptive strike. Your name was on the orders. You didn't know the aliens were peaceful. You only knew they had tech Earth wanted. You led the mission that turned first contact into a massacre. Marcus stepped back, shaking his head. No. No. I don't lead missions. I fly ships. I don't make policy. In your world. Maybe, Mira said. But this isn't your world anymore. He stared at her in the dim light. You're saying you came here to… What? Kill me. Stop me. She looked down. I came here to talk to you. To warn you. To give you a choice you never had before. Marcus was quiet for a long time. Then he asked the question he hadn't dared speak until now. Why do you have my name? Mira looked up, and her eyes shimmered with something that wasn't fear. It was pain. Because in my world, she said, you're not just the man who started the war. You're the man who saved me from it. You took me in. You raised me. You called me your daughter. Marcus stared at her, stunned. She continued, her voice trembling. I loved you, even after everything. I still do. Outside, the jungle howled. Strange shapes moved in the darkness. But inside the cave, only two people remained. A soldier with too many questions, and a girl from another universe, carrying his name, his past, and possibly humanity's future. Revelation. The jungle was still, but the silence felt wrong now. Too tight, like the world was holding its breath. Inside the cave, Marcus Hale sat against the stone wall, staring at the girl across from him. The girl who claimed to be his daughter from another universe. Her name was Mira, and she said he was the man who both saved her life and destroyed the future. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't even blink without her words echoing through his mind. You started the war. No, that wasn't him. That couldn't be him. Marcus had served in the Navy for 10 years. He followed orders. He kept people alive. He was a pilot, not a general. He didn't have the power to start a war. And yet, what if she was right? What exactly happened in your world? He asked, his voice low, almost unsure. Mira had her knees drawn up to her chest. She was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at him, not like a soldier, but like a daughter remembering a bad dream. You won, she said. Marcus blinked. What? In my timeline, the war started with a single attack. A preemptive strike against an alien confederation called the Zorath Compact. Earth believed they were hiding technology that could shift the balance of power in the galaxy. Command didn't want to take chances. We've never even heard of the Zorath, Marcus said. You will, Mira replied. In a few days, the UNSC receives an intercepted signal, faint, encoded, and misunderstood. It triggers a Black Ops response. They call it Operation Silent Sky. You're selected to lead it. He shook his head again. I don't lead missions. You do in my world. You took command when your captain fell ill. You followed the orders, even though something in you said it was wrong. You didn't ask questions. You believed the briefing. She looked down, her voice softening. They said it would be clean. Surgical. No civilian casualties. Marcus swallowed. But it wasn't, was it? Mira shook her head. You hit their capital. On a holiday. 500,000 lives, gone in under 5 minutes. The compact retaliated. Earth declared war, and in less than 2 years, humans were gone. The words landed like punches. Marcus sat frozen, jaw clenched. He wanted to argue, to scream, to demand proof. But part of him already knew the truth. It was the look in her eyes. Not just pain, not just memory. It was grief. You said I raised you, he said quietly. She nodded. After the war started, I was one of the lucky ones. You found me on a dying station. You've smuggled me out. We hid for years. You were all I had. But I still followed the orders. he asked. You were different then. Angry. Broken. You'd already lost so much. You thought war was the only way left. But even then, you loved me. You tried to make it right. Marcus leaned forward, voice tense. So I come back. Why not just let it happen again? Mira looked at him with something close to hope. Because you saved me once, and I believed, if I could find you before the war began, maybe you'd make a different choice. Maybe this time, you'd stop it before it started. A deep silence filled the cave. Marcus stood and began pacing. His mind was racing. None of this should be possible. Time travel, parallel universes. It was science fiction. Or it used to be. But now, nothing felt impossible anymore. And there was one thing he couldn't ignore. His name was on that dog tag. He turned to her. You said the signal comes in a few days, and Operation Silent Sky gets greenlit after that. Mira nodded. You know the encryption keys. Access logs. Who signed the order? She met his eyes. All of it. He stared at her. Then something inside him shifted. Not fear, not confusion. Purpose. You're going to show me, he said. Mira blinked. What? You're going to walk me through exactly what happens, what command does, what they say, who's in the room. I'm going to stop it before it begins. Mira stared at him, eyes wide, shimmering with something dangerous. Marcus, that means turning on your own, on your command, on Earth. I know, he said, but if what you're saying is true, Earth is gone in your world. If the price of saving it is breaking a few rules, then I'll break them. He walked to the mouth of the cave and looked up at the sky, 3 moons hanging above like watching eyes. I'm not starting this war, he whispered. Mira stood slowly behind him. No, she said, you're going to end it. The decision. The rain came without warning. Thick drops fell from the black sky, washing soot from the trees and ash from Marcus Hale's face. He stood outside the cave entrance, staring into the forest like it might answer him. But it didn't. Behind him, Mira sat cross-legged on the cave floor, drawing symbols in the dirt with a small rock. Not just symbols, patterns, military encryption signatures, key phrases, unit call signs, everything she knew about Operation Silent Sky, she was giving to him. Marcus had listened in silence for over an hour. No interruptions, no disbelief. Just quiet focus. Now, the storm was building. Not just in the sky, but inside him. He still couldn't explain how she was here. Still couldn't process that somewhere, in some other version of the galaxy, he'd destroyed everything. That he had become a name people whispered with hate. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was that she was here. And she remembered him, not as a killer, but as someone worth saving. He couldn't live with being anything less. Marcus stepped back into the cave, brushing rain off his face. Mira looked up. She could see it in his eyes. He'd made his decision. I need access to the UNSC relay, he said. There's a drop node 50 clicks east of here. If it's intact, I can jack in. You're going to warn them? Mira asked, rising to her feet. No, Marcus said. I'm going to burn the mission down from the inside. Mira's eyes widened. You'll be court-martialed, labeled a traitor, maybe worse. I don't care, he said. You said the strike gets triggered by a classified signal, right? I can rewrite the relay's data packet. Turn the message into a warning. Leak it anonymously to the compact. If they see it coming, they'll prepare. There won't be a clean hit. No quick victory. Mira stepped closer. They'll know it was you. I hope they do, Marcus said, his voice quiet and sharp. If Command wants a war, they'll have to explain how the targets vanished, how the element of surprise was lost, and if they push forward anyway, the blood won't be on my hands. She stared at him, eyes bright. That's not what you did last time, she whispered. No, Marcus said, but maybe this time, on someone else. He took a deep breath. He wasn't just walking into the storm. He was the storm now. 12 hours later, they reached the relay site. Or what was left of it. The station had slammed into a hillside during the crash. Its outer panels were torn, the antenna snapped, but the core was intact. A soft blue glow pulsed inside the half-buried structure. Marcus worked fast. He cracked the hatch with a pry tool and crawled inside. The place smelled like burned circuits and ozone. Mira stood guard outside, watching the jungle, watching the sky. Inside, Marcus linked his wristpad to the core terminal. A shaky connection lit up the screen. Static hissed. Data flickered. Then, access granted. He was in. Lines of classified code scrolled past. He found the encrypted signal Mira had warned him about. It hadn't been sent yet, but it was queued, ready to go. Command had planned this all along. Bastards, he muttered. He dug deeper, found the false translation of the alien signal. Command had twisted it, shaped it into a threat. It wasn't a warning. It was a plea for peace. They knew, and they'd lied. Marcus clenched his fists. Then he began rewriting the payload. He attached Mira's intel, the true message, the real intent of the Zoreth Compact. And at the end, he added a note, unsigned. This is not an act of war. This is a message of peace. Do not answer it with fire. He hit send. The screen dimmed. The data vanished into the void. It was done. He crawled out of the relay, back into the wind and rain. Mira stood waiting, eyes scanning the clouds. They'll come looking for you, she said. I know. They'll say you betrayed Earth. Then I'll remind them, Marcus said, what Earth is supposed to stand for. He looked at her, his daughter from another world, another war. Whatever happens next, he said, you don't let them turn me into the man you remember. You remind me, every time, who I'm supposed to be. She smiled through tears. I will. Thunder rolled in the distance, and far above, somewhere in orbit, the message flew across the stars, changing everything. The aftermath. They came for him at dawn. Not with searchlights or roaring dropships. No, the UNSC didn't want a scene. Just a small recon unit, 4 soldiers in black armor, moving quiet as shadows through the jungle mist. Marcus saw them coming long before they reached the cave. He'd been waiting. His rifle was already laid on the ground. Mira stood beside him, hood pulled low, silent. She had begged him to run. He had refused. You don't run from the truth, he had said. You stand in it. The lead soldier stepped forward, visor down, voice flat. Lieutenant Marcus Hale. You are ordered to come with us under Article 4 to 9 of the Interstellar Military Code. No resistance. No questions. Marcus nodded once. I understand. They bound his wrists, even though he didn't fight back. Mira tensed as they pushed him toward the shuttle. One soldier noticed her, hesitated, like he recognized she wasn't human. Marcus spoke fast. She's with me. She's done nothing wrong. The soldier's visor tilted. You're in no position to negotiate, sir. She's under my protection. A pause. Then the soldier looked away, said nothing. They let her stay. The journey back to command was silent. No words, just the low hum of the shuttle. Marcus sat in a corner, hands cuffed, eyes fixed on the floor. He could feel the pressure of every choice he'd made, every second of that message he'd sent. Had it even worked? Had anyone listened? Or had he just painted a target on his back for nothing? Hours passed. The stars outside blurred as the ship moved through slip space. Then, gravity shift. Re-entry. Landing. When the doors hissed open, it wasn't a courtroom or prison waiting for him. It was a chair. In the middle of a dimly lit room. And across from it, a man. Tall. Gray uniform. No name tag. Just rank. Admiral Saren Thorne. Marcus had seen his face only once before, in a mission briefing. Now they were eye to eye. "You're a hard man to pin down, Lieutenant," Thorne said. "I'm not hiding," Marcus replied. Thorne's eyes narrowed. "No, you're not. That's what makes this more complicated than it needs to be." He leaned forward, folding his hands. "You accessed a classified relay node. You transmitted encrypted intel to an unauthorized channel. That intel has now reached every major communications net across the sector, including those of the Zorath Compact." He tapped a console. The holoscreen flared to life behind him. It showed Marcus's altered message, his words playing on a loop. "This is not an act of war. This is a message of peace." Marcus held his ground. Was I wrong? Thorne didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pulled up another file. Surveillance footage. News feeds. Alien broadcasts. It was chaos. But not the kind Marcus had expected. No retaliatory strikes. No mobilizing fleets. No calls for blood. Just questions, debates, and a pause. The attack had been called off on both sides. No official word, no press releases, just silence. But in the UNSC war rooms, silence was the sound of plans being shredded. "You exposed us," Thorne said coldly. "To them. To our own people." "I exposed the truth," Marcus said. "And I stopped a war you didn't have the courage to admit was a mistake." Thorne stood slowly. "You broke the chain of command. I followed something higher." Thorne's jaw clenched, but he didn't speak. He just walked to the door, paused, then turned. "You should be in a cell," he said. "You should be erased from every system we have. Then why am I still breathing?" The Admiral's eyes hardened. "Because someone on the council thinks your hero moment just saved their careers. Because some of them want to pin you to a medal and call it a peace movement. But make no mistake, Lieutenant, you are one misstep away from vanishing." He opened the door. "You're being discharged. Immediately. No trial. No fanfare. As of now, you're no longer Navy. You're no longer ours." Marcus stood, slowly. "That's fine," he said. "I was never yours to begin with." They dropped him at a neutral outpost 2 sectors out. No escort, no warning. Mira was waiting for him at the landing dock. When he stepped off the ship, bruised but upright, she ran to him without a word. For a long time, they just stood there, the noise of the port blurring into background static. "You're free," she said. "No," Marcus replied. "I'm unfinished." She looked up, confused. He smiled, faintly. "They can strip the uniform, Mira. But they can't take back what we did." She nodded. "People are talking. Across worlds. Some want war. Some want truth. That's all we ever needed," he said. "A moment to think. A second chance." They walked into the crowd together, just 2 shadows among thousands. But change had begun. And for the first time in 100 years, the future was unwritten. The change. 10 years later. The sky over Luna Prime was no longer gray. Once, Earth's moon had been a military outpost. Cold, secretive, weaponized. But now, its domes were made of crystal alloy and living glass, lit from within by the pulse of a new world. Ships from every known system hovered in its upper orbit. Zorath bioships, Terran vessels, even hybrid cruisers built with tech from both sides. At the heart of it all stood the Unity Spire, a tower that reached toward the stars like a question humanity had finally dared to ask. What if we chose peace, on purpose? Inside, the halls of the Interstellar Council buzzed with quiet energy. Diplomats passed through archways carved with alien languages. Artificial gravity shifted gently between zones. Old enemies now walked side by side, guarded not by soldiers, but by shared purpose. And on the observation deck, looking out at Earth's distant blue glow, stood Marcus Hale. He wore no uniform now, just a simple black coat. His hair was streaked with silver, his stance calmer, heavier with time. The weight of what he had done, and what he had refused to do, was still with him. But he didn't regret any of it. The door behind him opened with a soft hiss. He didn't need to turn. "I heard your speech," said a familiar voice. "You still talk too long." He smiled. "I've had practice." Mira Hale stepped beside him, her reflection joining his in the window. She was taller now, stronger. Her silver-blue skin shimmered under the soft light, her eyes no longer haunted but bright with purpose. She wore a diplomat's robe marked with the symbols of the Compact and the Turin Accord, a bridge between worlds. The tag still hung around her neck, the one that bore his name. She glanced at him, half smiling. "You never told them what you did. You never took credit." "They didn't need to know," he said. "They just needed the truth. And time." "Still," she said, "you changed everything." Marcus shook his head slowly. "We did." Together, they looked out at the stars. A small alien child darted past the glass corridor behind them, laughing as it chased a floating light drone. A human girl followed, grinning, no fear in her eyes. Two worlds, once at the edge of war, now playing in the same light. "This place," Mira said softly, "was impossible in my world. Nothing like it ever stood. There were only ruins, ash, warnings scratched into the bones of dead cities." She paused. "But now, there's hope." Marcus leaned on the railing. "Hope's not a guarantee. It's a decision. One you have to make again and again, every single day." "You sound like a philosopher," she teased. "No," he said. "Just an old soldier who finally stopped pulling the trigger." They stood in silence for a while, letting the quiet speak. And then Mira said the words that lingered in Marcus's mind long after she was gone. "You didn't just save me from the wreckage. You saved all of us from what we were becoming." He turned to her. And this time, he didn't look at her as the mystery girl who had appeared from a dying timeline. He looked at her as the proof that humanity could grow, could listen, could change. "Maybe," he said, "you saved me first." Far above them, stars burned like whispers in the dark. Some still plotted war. Others feared the peace would break. But for now, just for now, the galaxy stood on the edge of something greater. Not because humanity had conquered, not because it had destroyed, but because one man made a choice. And this time, humanity said no to war.